north of 0, south of 0, southeasterly 3, increasing 4 or 5,
Fisher,
occasionally
German
6
Bight,
later, veering
west or northwest 3 or 4, increasing 5 or 6.
Fastnet, Irish Sea,
Showers.
west backing
Good.
southwest 4 or 5, occasionally 6 later in North Irish Sea.
The ferry to the Isle of Wight was packed with people aged over 60 from north of Watford and me. It's a short hop across the Solent, no more than half an hour, but my journey was accompanied by the soundtrack of half a mobile phone conversation from the seat behind. Imagine, if you will, the low thrumming and vibration of a ferry's engines providing the bass accompaniment to the following monologue. Hello? Hello? It's Nana. Aye, Nana. I'm on a boat. A boat? Aye, a boat. I'm on a boat to the Isle of Wight. Aye. Nana loves you. Yes, she does. Nana's on a boat, and she loves you. For a full 30 minutes. The Isle of Wight is diamond-shaped and larger than you might think. Its spine runs east to west, a huge chalk hill rising in the centre and culminating at the western tip of the island at the notorious Needles. Running a finger down the index of any Wight history book turns up names like Charles Dickens, Lewis Carroll, Henry Fielding, Christopher Isherwood, Thomas Hardy, John Keats, Elizabeth Sewell, William Makepeace Thackeray and Alfred Lord Tennyson. Swinburne was born near Shanklin. Charles Darwin commenced writing on the origin of species in Sandown, yards from the place where Lewis Carroll wrote The Hunting of the Snark. Dickens, who wrote some of David Copperfield in Ventnor, set the honeymoon of Mr. and Mrs. Lamel from our mutual friend in Shanklin, writing of their footsteps visible in the sand. I set out in the early evening along the same stretch of beach in search of Shanklin Chine, a deep ravine cut into the cliff by thousands of years of water that runs from the old village on the cliff top down to the end of the esplanade. It trickles and tumbles in waterfalls of varying magnitude, banked by ferns, plants and green pools. A path crisscrosses the water, and with its fern canopy providing a roof and keeping the noise of the world at bay, it's little wonder that the Chine has been imbued with magical properties. It was a warm evening, and the sun was going down when I arrived at the bottom of the Chine to discover that it would cost me £3.50 to walk up it. Avaricious, this may have seemed, although there has been an admission charge since the footpath was built in Keats' time, but nothing could detract from the charm of the place. A confirmed traditionalist, even I had to admit that the subtle coloured floodlights and strings of fairy lights actually enhanced, rather than detracted from its magic. Wight's most westerly point, a jagged row of chalk teeth that have seen off countless ships over the centuries, is arguably its most recognisable landmark. It could be a place of dignity, a place where visitors can wonder at nature and the power of the sea and lose themselves in the solitude of their surroundings. It could be that, but it isn't. It isn't thanks to whoever decided to put a fairground come pleasure park there. The merry-go-round was going round, but there was nothing remotely merry about it. Boarded-up booths marked Hollywood Bowl and Tin Can Alley, rocked gently in the wind. A hot dog stand was open. Inside, a radio blared so loudly that whatever was playing was totally unrecognisable. Over a century earlier, in 1897, Marconi had sent some of the first ever radio signals from this spot to a post office in Poole Harbour. I was glad that he wasn't here now. A few seconds' exposure to the wall of distortion coming over the sausages and bread rolls would have had him heaving his equipment into the sea. And the Needles themselves, all but obscured by mist. On the face of it, Portland doesn't look promising. A bleak, treeless, wind-blasted lump of rock the shape of South America, hanging off the bottom of Britain that looms up menacingly at you as you approach the causeway from Weymouth. It's home to a prison, a borstal, and a prison hulk is more than its harbour. Driving across the causeway and up the steep, winding street that runs through Fortuneswell, the town at the end of the causeway, I headed south for Portland Bill, where the gentle slope of island reaches the sea. It was a calm, sunny day, but just a couple of 100 yards or so out to sea, white foam tips betrayed the clash of currents that make the Bill such a dangerous place for shipping. Portland's churchyards are full of shipwreck victims, and the walls of the museum are covered in pictures of boats of various vintages lying at curious angles in the surf. The churning sea over treacherous rocks is known as Portland Race, labelled by Hilaire Belloc as the master terror of our world. 14 ships were lost here in one stormy night in 1901, just 10 years before the prototype shipping forecast would be broadcast. Nearly a century earlier, the Earl of Abergavenny had run aground and broken up, costing 260 lives, among them the ship's captain, John Wordsworth, William's brother. I'd wondered how so many could perish when a ship is so close to land, but dropping onto the shelving rocks below the lighthouse, you see at close hand the power of the waves that hurl themselves at the shore even on a calm day. Combine these waves, sharp half-submerged rocks, gale-force winds, driving rain and bits of ship flying about the place, and it's not hard to understand how the sea has claimed its victims here. The wringing of hands that greeted the renaming of Finisterre was quintessentially British. The trouble began when it became clear that Britain's Finisterre region differed in size from the sea area of the same name used by the Spanish. Quite reasonably, the Spanish argued that as it was their coast and their waters, it ought to be Britain who renamed our area. The Met Office was all for it. After all, it gave them the chance to commemorate their founder and the man directly responsible for the birth of the shipping forecast itself. But no, this is Britain, where we don't do change, especially when it means kowtowing to Johnny Foreigner. There were letters to the Times and the Telegraph. Mrs. Stephanie Waring of Tyneside, who with her sister had named 3 of their daughters Shannon, Bailey and Tyne, told the Today programme, "Fitzroy sounds more like a Doberman dog than a sea area." I was all for the change. The forecast would lose a little of its poetry, but it represented a more fitting memorial for a pioneering meteorologist. Which is why I found myself in the bus station at Santiago de Compostela one muggy afternoon, buying a ticket to the end of the world via the coast of death. The westernmost tip of mainland Europe, Cape Finisterre sits on the Costa da Morte. It was the Romans who named my destination Finis Terrae, the end of the earth, because back then that's exactly what it was, the westernmost point of the known world. There were a number of people milling about in the bus station who looked a bit odd. Most of them were sinewy, weathered, and all bore the same expression, a kind of relaxed, healthy satisfaction. These were pilgrims heading for home after completing the Way of St. James, the ancient pilgrimage to the reputed bones of the saint housed in the elaborate cathedral of Santiago de Compostela. The real hardcore pilgrims press on for Finisterre, several days' walk beyond Santiago. As I threw my hold-all into the belly of the Finisterre bus, it was followed by a couple of rucksacks and a pair of pilgrims' staffs. I'd booked into the Hotel Finisterre, but when I presented myself at reception, it turned out they weren't expecting me at all. They'd never heard of me, in fact. It didn't matter, though, because there was only one other guest booked into the 48-room hotel that night, so it's not as if there was a shortage of space. I was, however, put into the room next to the other guest, whose foghorn snoring coming through the wall would keep me awake for most of the night. I rose early the next morning and had a stroll around town before heading out to the Faro de Finisterre. As I progressed along the headland, the Atlantic shone a deep blue, the fierce sun reflecting off the water in a million shifting silver shards that were never still. It was very quiet, and I was the only walker on the road. There was hardly a breath of wind, and the Atlantic was calm. I approached the lighthouse, an immaculate white building with green shutters and the words Faro de Finisterre above the doorway, and walked past it to the rocks that mark the end of the world. I was also now the westernmost person on the European mainland. I began to understand why this was such a spiritual place, going back thousands of years beyond Christianity to the Celts. Out there was the Celtic Tirnanog, the land of eternal youth. This headland was where the physical world met the spiritual world. There is probably no better place to earn a sense of your own mortality than the headland at Finisterre. From the erstwhile tip of the known world, I headed uphill rather than back around the headland, along a winding road so steep I thought I was going to scrape my nose on the tarmac. Passing between forests of shady pines, after about 20 minutes I found a tiny pathway of trodden grass. This was what I was looking for. As I crested the hill, facing east, I saw a giant boulder ahead of me. Rounding the boulder, I found that it served as one wall of a tiny ruined building, no more than 20 feet long to the base of the overhanging boulder and 6 wide. Stunted walls emerged from the undergrowth, rising 3 feet from the ground with pink flowers growing from between the stones. At the far end was a rock whose top had long ago been chiselled into a bowl shape, allowing rainwater to collect. By the right-hand wall, as you looked out across the bay to Monte Pindo, the Mount Olympus of the Celtic gods, was a long, flat stone slab into which long lines had been scored, and a dip cut at one end in the vague shape of a very small person. This was the ancient hermitage of San Guillermo. Guillermo is believed to have lived here alone for many years in the 6th century. San Guillermo's bed, the flat slab with the slight hollow to lay his head, is believed to have magical fertility properties, and for centuries, couples having trouble conceiving have come here to do the business. Considering it had taken me a good sweaty 2 hours to walk here, not to mention the fact that it looked decidedly uncomfortable, you'd have to have a fairly determined libido to succeed in performing the necessaries, let alone have a chance to spawn life. But clearly it must work. Laid carefully on the bed, presumably in thanks for the recent birth of a local child that had been conceived here, was a white lace handkerchief, on which someone had placed a small bunch of wild red flowers, weighed down with a couple of stones. I left the old hermitage and walked over the top of the hill again, where the late afternoon sun was continuing its relentless crawl towards the Atlantic horizon beyond. I stayed up there for the rest of the day, parking myself on a big rock that I learned later was part of the ancient Ara Solis, a temple to the sun that predates Stonehenge. Eventually, the sun set, leaving only pinky purple fringes on the wispy clouds. Away to my left, the lighthouse at the tip of the headland flickered into life and swung its beam around. The wind was turning chilly as the sky darkened, but the rocks of the temple were still warm to the touch from the day's sunshine, as if it was storing up energy from the flaming star whose worship it facilitated. The amazing snoring man had checked out, so I spent a night disturbed only by the moonlight before departing under darkness the next morning. As the bus rounded the coast of death to leave Finisterre behind, a slight brightening in the eastern sky denoted that the sun was on its way back from the land of eternal youth to the end of the world. Somewhere, up on a dark hill, some drying flowers on a slab of rock rustled slightly in the breeze. Even on the coast of death, new life begins.
Malin Hebrides, south or southeast, backing northeast 5 to 7. Showers,
Rockall,
then rain.
southwest veering west 4 or 5, increasing 6 or
Northwest
7.
Fitzroy, variable 3 or 4, mainly fair, good.